Hello and welcome to this session, which is part of the Enabling Quality Postgraduate Education project funded by the Department of Higher Education and Training in collaboration with the Community of Practice for Postgraduate Education run by the University South Africa. Today we are joined by 4 international speakers, all of whom have done research into this issue of the oral exam at doctoral level. Given that very few South African universities have an oral exam as part of the doctoral examination, and that the recent review of the doctorate in South Africa recommended that this becomes part of our usual practice, this is an issue of great interest for all of us. And we are greatly looking forward to hearing who have this expertise. We will start with Professor Martin Cortazzi, who has dual affiliation at the University of Warwick in the UK and the City University of Macau in China. Over to you, Martin.
For me, taking advice from the Chesham and book about these, I introduced the idea of a Viva from the moment of starting a PhD. And I would do this with 2 core questions and then some other questions and then an activity. I'll tell you briefly about them. The core questions are, what are your questions and why are they worthwhile? And what are the answers and why are they worthwhile? I would then split that down, and this would be potential Viva questions, but certainly my thinking as an examiner about the literature review, what the scope of it is, how things have been chosen, why they're worthwhile, and how they lead to a gap or a niche or a research statement, and then the research questions. Similarly with the methodology, what are the alternatives? Why did you choose what you chose? And why are those methods worthwhile? Likewise, with any results or outcomes, any alternative interpretations, anything that I would raise that the candidate has apparently not considered, and why are the results worthwhile? And I would then have something about what we might call the big picture, which is, how does the work in your relate to general knowledge or current issues or development in the field? Along with that, as an initial activity for starting a PhD program, day 1, week 1, I have a seminar activity where 30 or more candidates are in groups of 3 or 4. I give them some criteria from a range of international universities from their regulations describing the PhD criteria. They ask them as data, as qualitative data, understand them, classify them, comment on them, see what's going on, and then, of course, relate them to a Viva. And this is, as it were, an initial activity in commencing a PhD. Of course, what they come across are things like original connection to knowledge, understanding of research, being independent, having a literary presentation, exercising critical judgment, showing that it's your own work, and similar things. I'd now like to make a couple of points about examiners and answers. The examiners might be 2 or 3, depending on the university and which. They could be called a panel or a committee or a jury. And in some countries, there are a minimum of 5, often 7, and occasionally 10 or 15 or more. So it gives us an idea of international variation and some flexibility. Similarly, in many countries, there's an audience for the Viva. For example, Poland, Thailand, Portugal, Argentina, Uganda, Mozambique, the USA, and I mentioned particularly Bulgaria and the Netherlands, just to give an idea of how the Viva themselves might vary and what possibilities are around. In Bulgaria, the examiners will make publicly available their comments, which are then circulated to the candidate, who prepares a Viva, and then has the opportunity of a second Viva, maybe a couple of months later, and to the second Viva, which is the real one, the public are invited. In the Netherlands, it has aspects of ritual and celebration as well as examination. So the one that we attended in Amsterdam started with some music, an academic procession of the examiners and others coming onto stage, the candidate giving a speech. She had already published a book available, and that book was essentially the thesis. Then the examiners, 10 or 12, 3 or 4 definitely from outside the Netherlands, others from different universities, they asked questions in turn. Surprisingly to me, there was no discussion. And then the examiners left the room. Back later, having made their decision, the decision was announced. There were speeches, the candidate to the speeches, and then the PhD certificate was produced and was signed, and that was it. The candidate walked off with the certificate in hand. This gives an idea of some variation. I think, in my experience, there are different kinds of exams, and this is a really important point about whether there is examiner training and conferences and open discussion between examiners. The convention is they make independent reports which are shared before a viva. Experience suggests them are picky nitpickers. They insist on details, going page by page perhaps through the dissertation. The candidate finds this difficult. His or her voice gets lower and lower. They lose enthusiasm. They get the impression they're failing because of the style of the exam, even before it's finished. Others might be willing to show off and demonstrate their own, which may or may not have been included in the thesis, rather than having a discussion. Others might be, and perhaps somewhat inflexible on conventions, regulations, forms, particular styles of writing, and so on. And a few might be in the game, apparently, to find fault and find things wrong with the thesis rather than make a judgment. Far better to see the viva as a scholarly conversation, a dialogue. We're fair, we're open-minded, we can be friendly, critical, certainly exploring and explaining and engaging in academic scholarly argument with evidence and examples and so on. The point of raising this is to show variation in examiners as well as audiences and as well as in the nature of how vivas and theses are conceived around the world. There's room for more standardization. There is some, for example, attempts in Europe to have some standardization. But I raise the comments and then I finish. They're questions, really. One is, in which language should the viva be? Whose language? Bearing in mind huge numbers of candidates are international, either studying in another country or studying in a language which is not their first or second. And an allied question to that is whether if the candidates are multilingual, are the supervisors and is the viva multilingual? Possibly. In Luxembourg, it has to be. It has to be in at least 2 languages for part of the. That raises questions about communication, the style of communication, the openness of communication, bearing in mind most candidates will be nervous and many are asked to give a presentation. That's the style of a university or some is a national system. How long is such a presentation? 10 minutes? 20 minutes? The examiners have read the thesis. The presentation doesn't need to tell them what they've already read. Countries, it might be 1 hour or even 2 hours. And of course, that runs all the risk of being boring and off-putting for most people. Another couple of questions is, one is, before the viva, does a university or a system demand publication in advance? This is common. It's regulations in cities, And some places, such as many Chinese prestigious universities, are actually downplaying this or leaving it because they believe that it might lower the quality of the publications for the university. And finally, a question. Why wouldn't we have a Viva? In Europe, many bachelor's courses have a Viva for projects and tasks and dissertations for final year programs. Many master's degrees have a Viva for dissertations and so on. So it is a natural extension for the PhD, which is surely grander, more important, more professional, research-based, to have a Viva. It seems to me that reasons for not having are probably financial and logistic, but they could be overcome by the value of a Viva, which in the cases of good ones is undoubted, demonstrable, evidence in reports, evidence from what examiners and candidates say. That's what I finish with. Hello.
Thank you so much, Martin. Yeah, a heck of a lot of things to consider in that brief moment. Yeah, I'm looking forward to raising some questions to you as soon as we open it for questions. But for now, I'm going to move straight on to the next person. And I think that's Carolyn. Carolyn Jackson from Lancaster University. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure, and it's great to be here with so many people. I've got a few PowerPoint slides, so I'm going to share, if that's okay. Just 1 second.
Perfect, yeah.
So I'm hoping you can see that. Can you?
Yeah, yes, yeah. Perfect.
Brilliant. Okay. So it follows on nicely from Martin's, I think, because Martin gave us a good sense of how varied the PhD Viva is in different international contexts. I'm going to focus almost entirely on the doctoral Viva in the UK, and I'll just what I'm basing my comments on here. So it was quite a few years ago now. I did quite a lot of research on the PhD Viva in the UK, and that involved work with Penny Sinclair, who's at Manchester University. And we started off with an institutional policy survey across 20 universities. Say much about that because things have probably moved on, apart from, I think, to flag that, two things. External examiners often weren't that aware of the policy of the institution which they were examining. Many of them just assumed that the policy would be the same as their own institution, which it often isn't, because there was a lot of variability. So I think one lesson is to make sure when you've got an external examiner coming in that they are aware of the key features of the policy and don't just assume it's the same as their own institution. And the second thing, I think, it was to flag that at the time there were very few safeguards in place around quality standards. And since then, I think in the UK, things have shifted quite a lot. So it's much more common now to have an independent chair or to have Viva's audio recorded in case of appeal. So those are the two things I'd flag in relation to that, I think. And of course, I'm talking here, I mean, Martin's already said about the Viva in the UK, where it's very much a kind of closed door experience, where there's an internal exam, usually an internal examiner, an external examiner, sometimes two if the candidate's a member of staff at the institution. Supervisor is sometimes in attendance as a non-speaking observer, and then there's sometimes a chair as well as the candidate. So it's a very small affair that occurs behind closed doors largely. We also did a questionnaire survey in two universities, and we got perspectives of external examiners, internal examiners, candidates and supervisors. We did really interesting interviews with doctoral candidates before and after the Viva. We interviewed around 20 experts, so they were people that were maybe deans of doctoral schools, or they were researching PhD Vivas and so on. And then we got more informal information from colleagues about their experiences of being academics and their interactions with Vivas. And then since then, and as I said, that work was a one book. The doctoral examination was published in 2004, so we are talking some time. Since then, I work in a department at Lancaster where almost all of our work is with PhD students. We've got a number of doctoral programs, so that's what we do almost all the time. So I've supervised a lot of students and done a lot of examining both in the UK and internationally. So that's just basically what I'm drawing on in this presentation. So I just want to say, really, based on the research that we did, what we saw, what academics saw as the main purpose of the PhD Viva in the UK. And these are the key points. I'll just talk through them very briefly, but you can see that from the from the percentages of people who responded in these ways, that there's no clear consensus about what the PhD Viva is for. And clearly it serves a number of different purposes. And the different colours here, so the black ones are really about the Viva as an examination. The orange one, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute, is about more development purposes, which I think are really important. And then the kind of reddy coloured one at the bottom is more about a rite of passage or a ritual, which I think fits much more in some cases with what Martin's talked about the ways in which Vivas work in contexts outside of the UK. But basically, I mean, I think these points speak for themselves, so I won't say a lot about them, but the kind of the most common response about the purpose of the PhD Viva was about basically checking the candidate's understanding, ability to produce research to PhD standard. And I'll flag towards the end, but, you know, PhD standards vary as well. You know, some PhDs are excellent, some are just good enough. So I think it's really important to think about the range of what constitutes a PhD. They're clearly not all the same, but that's a sense of, you know, it's good to talk to the candidate, make sure they understand and have produced research that's at PhD standards or might get to PhD standard with more work. To clarify areas of weakness that the examiners have judged to be weakness based on reading the thesis, and to talk around those and see whether it's about the lack of way it's been communicated or whether it is a real lack of understanding. Ensure authenticity, I think, is basically about making sure it's the candidate's own work and that they're able to discuss it and demonstrate that they've done it. And then I think that the orange one about developing ideas further and advice on publication is really important. So sometimes it's about basic development. So it's about developing ideas so that the PhD, if it's not already at PhD standard, can be brought up to it. And then sometimes it's about more advanced development. So, you know, the work's already at PhD standard, probably maybe what ways can it be developed further for publication and life beyond the PhD. So I think there's those two distinctions there about developing ideas: basic development, how to get it to PhD level; advanced development, what they can do beyond the PhD. Thesis defense. I mean, often the Viva's called the defense, and and hopefully that's not the case. The candidates that we spoke to did welcome a kind of Viva that was probing and that was engaging and where there was a degree of change. What none of the candidates wanted or liked or appreciated was an aggressive Viva, or where the tone was one that was aggressive. So I think that's really important to remember. Challenge, probing is something that candidates generally welcome, a sense of real engagement with the ideas and the work, but not in a way that is that feels like they're being attacked, and that the tone of the Viva is an unfriendly and confrontational one. Test the knowledge of the broader context was a key thing as well. And this varied a lot. I mean, I should say that there were clear disciplinary differences in all of these areas. So testing knowledge of the broader context was one that came up a lot. And what that meant varied between different disciplines. So, for example, in electronics, there was one candidate who was asked about how a particular, I think it was a thermostat, something like that worked, in chemistry, one candidate was given a paper to read and summarize in the Viva. Now, they were really unusual examples. They weren't common by any means, but the ways in which examiners interpreted demonstrating knowledge of the broader context did vary, and it varied by discipline. Testing oral skills was another one that came out. I agree with Martin entirely about, the issues about language. And certainly in Lancaster's policy, it's very clear that it's not a test of how well people can communicate in English. It's not a test of English, and that you've got to be really careful. But the Vivas are conducted in English, but that it's not about testing candidates' capabilities of speaking English. Final decision making in borderline cases, and I think this was important as well. In the majority of cases in our research, I think it's around about 3/4 of cases in the survey, the Viva was basically a site where the examiner's judgment based on reading the thesis were confirmed. So that was the main role of it, a kind of confirmation of the judgment made on the basis of reading the thesis. I think where that really varied quite a lot, and where I find it helpful, is where it does feel a bit borderline. Is this going to be a resubmission, or is it going to be one that requires any corrections? And in those borderline cases, I think the Viva can be really helpful in terms of teasing out, well, does it require resubmission? Is the candidate really, do you think the candidate's able to make the corrections that you're going to be requesting, and so on, and in what kind of time frame? So I think that's a really important thing to remember. And then as a rite of passage or ritual, and as I say, I think from Martin's conveyed that it's much more ritualistic and much more embedded in a rite of passage in some other countries other than the UK, in terms of the Viva. Happy to talk about any of these in the questions. Just quickly to say as well, of course, the purpose of the Viva varies a bit in relation to how the thesis is judged based on reading it. So if it's a strong thesis, the focus is often more on authenticating it, clarifying, developing any points, and often on providing that kind of more advanced developmental role if it's already seen to be at a PhD level. Where it's borderline or possibly a referred thesis, again, the focus there is often much more on thinking about teasing out ideas, working out what needs to be done, seeing how much the candidate understands, and deciding on the extent of corrections required. So giving really kind of constructive feedback guidance and exploring the issues that may need to be worked through. And then in the very rare cases, certainly in the UK, very rare cases where it's not, where it's failed, to explore why that's the case and ensure that's what the decision is going to be. Just a few final points then, just to close. And again, I think Martin's flagged some of these. I think as examiner, and when you're thinking about who should be examiner, and this is not specific to the Viva, but I think that the fact that there is a Viva puts this in sharp relief, that you want somebody who's going to examine what has been done, not what they would like to have been done. So I think choosing examiners who are open to different approaches and are open to the approach that the candidate's taken is really important. And being clear about, if a thesis is not at PhD level, being clear about what needs doing to get it to PhD level. And then, as I flagged, there's a range of different standards of PhD. My approach is usually, well, what's the kind of bare minimum that needs to be done to get this to PhD level? It doesn't have to be perfect, nothing ever is, but what does it need to do to get to PhD level? And I've already made that next point. I think from my perspective as an examiner as well, when you so usually in the years, those examiners write independent reports, they exchange them in advance of the Viva, and then have a discussion about what the agenda is going to be. And that agenda setting in advance of the Viva is really, really important. And especially so, I think, if you are likely to be requiring corrections, because Lancaster's rules are very explicit. You need, if you're going to ask students to make corrections, then you need to have given them time to discuss them in the Viva. So thinking about what the agenda is going to be and making sure that you prioritize the things that might need to be changed are crucial. And I think also just being explicit about what you're doing in the Viva. If questions relate to advanced development and they're not things that you're particularly concerned about at the thesis, flagging that, you know, I'm asking this question in relation to what you might do when you move on to publish later on. I've already said this, but students appreciate deep and probing questions, but the tone's really important. No wanted or light, aggressive or hostile tone. And I've finished with a quote that shows how important and how long lasting the impacts of the Viva can be. Ensuring that examiners know and adhere to the university regulations. So as I say, at Lancaster, we've got an independent chair. In some cases, we always record the Viva. Some people don't like that it's going to be recorded. If they know in advance they don't want to do it, fine, but yeah, that's the system. And I think, again, Martin flagged this about mentoring early career staff into examining, and in my department we always make sure that early career scholars observe Viva to see how they're conducted before they would do any. So I'm going to finish with this last quote, and it's from one of our interviewees who passed their Viva with no corrections, but the experience of it clearly left them very scarred. So this person said, the purpose of the PhD is to subject the candidate to the most unnecessary form of misery and humiliation possible, then to check that they really are responsible for the work presented for examination. Finally, to remind the candidate that they have a long to go before they can achieve the superior knowledge of senior academics. I have never felt more of a failure and a fraud than when I passed this examination. And I think that's, you know, it's unusual, but it's really important to remember the experience of the Viva, even if the outcome is successful, can have such a major impact on somebody who's been working for years on a piece of work that, you know, the tone and the style of the exam is so important. We don't want people to be left feeling like this candidate did. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion a bit later. Thank you.
Sure, thank you so much. Once again, I'm left with loads of scribbled questions, but I shall be a good chair, move straight on. Unfortunately, our third speaker, Consolata Kabonesa, is not yet with us. She's really battling to get online from Makerere University in Uganda, but she is still trying. So we are really hopeful that she will join us before the session is finished. But it does mean that I'm going to jump straight ahead to Gina. Gina Wisker from University of Bath. As you will note, I've been popping a few articles in the chat bar from our speakers where they have written about the Viva, and I'm kind of randomly choosing a few articles. All of our speakers today have actually written a number of articles, and of course Gina's also the author of the book The Good Supervisor, which discusses the Viva. Over to you, Gina.
Thank you. I'm going to try and share my screen because Carolyn, other colleagues managed to do that, so we'll see. Right.
Yep, perfect.
Yep. There we go. Good. I revel in death by PowerPoint, so I'll save you some of that because actually everyone else has wonderfully covered what it's for and what it can do in extending it, and I love the failure and fraud bit that Caroline joined in, because actually, however kind we feel we're being when we're vivering students, however much we think that it can be a dialogue, it's still an exam for them, and an in-person exam, which is quite terrifying. So I think the duty of care thing is one of the things that is going to come out in what I'm sharing with you. So I've probably vivaed over 50 students, and in New Zealand and Finland and other bits of Scandinavia, but mostly in the UK. And one of the issues that one of you brought up that I'd like to join in on is things to do it when it's not your first language. So the big PhD group that I used to work with, it was always their second or third language. So quite difficult working at that high intellectual level for a doctoral student. It is not their first language. So being kind about that and explaining things if it's necessary, so that they can use their you know, the wonderful things that they've actually produced in the doctorate and not feel hampered by the language issues. Anyway, that's just a few thoughts. So people treat it differently. Some people are terrified and some think at long last I can talk about my work. So what's it for? Initially ensuring the work and text of the candidate. And I think that is again significant in an age of Gen AI, because it's possible that somebody might send in a thesis. I do know a single instance of this that they didn't do themselves, and the Viva will show that up because they won't be able to answer. And certainly if they've used a lot of AI, and Sue and I differ over our values about AI somewhat. If they haven't done it, that will also show it up. So I think that's come back in. Yes, it's a rite of passage as a researcher and a writer, recognizing and confirming doctorateness, which is this contribution to knowledge at a high level. And it offers an opportunity for candidates to own and share and discuss and explore their own work with interested expert colleagues. And I'm trying to diffuse that hierarchical kind of experience that people feel with their examiners, because I do feel about it being a dialogue that celebrates as well as asks, really questions, so that they can show they've done the tough thinking. So what's it for? Confirm the quality, enable collegial dialogue, explore the decisions made, maybe by the examiners beforehand. In the UK, go on about this because you all know, the examiners examine beforehand and write reports, and then they come up with the questions and then go into the Viva. And that sometimes their decisions are from having just read the thesis are changed in the Viva, and that's mostly positive, as in it seemed a little wooden, but as soon as the candidate brought it to life, you can see that this is definitely at PhD level. They question errors, we question errors and the complexities, and sometimes this enables the student to make a more coherent form and argument in person. So I've seen people bloom when they're actually talking about, so being very positive here. Pitfalls, the dynamics of the Viva might silence or confuse the candidate. Once that's happened, you're in a limited space and limited time, and it's very difficult for them to come back into controlling their work at the level that they actually produced it. A terror of being in the examination space, and the bits of research I'm going to share in a minute are a bit about that. And there might be some misunderstandings. Difficulties of expressing complex decisions and dealing with questions orally on the spot, unless you're used to it. Second or third language, it's going to be more tough. And with intellectual strangers in a role of power. And this can lead to underperformance or misunderstandings, but a well-managed Viva can often deal with some of this, and that's up to us as examiners, and maybe it's also up to the role of chair, who is acting quite often, I think, not only as there's all the internal rules, but as a bit of a host, checking occasionally that the candidate is happy to. So possibilities, it confirms achievement. It shows that we've got new, fuller understanding that's come out through talking through the thesis and the questions and what's been found. And so this intellectual collegial discussion can enable people to express their work at a really high level and really own it. So bits and pieces of research that I've done in the past in the doctoral learning journeys, which goes into the good supervisor and all the rest of it. We also looked at the examination at the Viva, and I interviewed quite a lot of examiners. And two of the things they said, one of them said, in the Viva, we were able to ask questions in such a way that he indicated that he, I can't actually read this for other people, he had done some of the corrections. And so we said, okay. So yes, I've already seen to that in between the time I sent the thesis in and your questions. And somebody else said that the Viva added a conceptual level to the paperwork. So they brought it to life. And that's how I see it. I know there's a whole range of different approaches, but I think the Viva is so important that to establish a relationship with the student or candidate, however we refer to them, and to ask the kind of questions no one will ever ask them again. Honor their work and take it seriously and ask pressing questions. And somebody else said there's those Vivas when there's a leaning forward and they're enjoying the conversation because you're taking it seriously. And you often think that you're there to catch them out. They're not to do that. Someone else says, in my own Viva, I learned something. I understood something from the questions they asked me, and I thought, oh, I see, yes. And for me, that means they had an aha moment. This is the candidate, and they go through a kind of conceptual threshold. So it can be a nice positive learning experience. Another piece of research that we've done recently is looking at the Viva when you take it online. because a lot of them have been done online, particularly in New Zealand, and you can see Rachel Smith from Dunedin, University of Otago, in there in our little group. But the rest of us, I've done a couple for her historically, so I've been both at a distance and in New Zealand. And so naturally they've done a lot of them online because they couldn't fly examiners in. But of course with COVID, we did put them all online. But at the University of Bath, where I am, they're pretty much all online because the doctoral students are all over the world, and so are their examiners. The four of us did some autoethnographic work, and then we thematically analysed it, and we probed what was it like for examiners and candidates. And if this moves, I'll be able to tell you. Yeah, that's us. Go off that. Merged. That space, presence and place, institutional and personal dimensions were important. That worry and anxiety about technology was another institutional personal dimension. There was a sense from the respondents that they were aware of their academic capital, and they crossed some thresholds. In other words, through being engaged with the Viva and even online, they were able to muster their thoughts and their ownership of their contribution, and through sharing it, they felt they'd uplifted. But we found that with the online Viva in particular, that a higher duty of care was necessary because of the technology and because of where the Viva was taking place. We brought in, we obviously had Bourdieu because it was about academic capital, but at the point at which we analysed our data, we found that the things that were being said about technology breaking down and people being fearful of that and thinking I'm going to spend all the time trying to plug the darn thing back in and not really be able to talk about the theoretical perspectives very clearly. We all know that. I'm in South Africa at the moment because things do stop with load shedding, but they stop in people's back rooms at home as well, or if somebody unplugs the wrong thing in the dining room. And so we looked at that, and we also heard from, we were the respondents, and it was analysed, that people were a bit worried that they were doing it in the home space. So it's not just it's that the dog might come in, or somebody will bang on the door and demand that you take this parcel, even though you've put a notice up. And also that the family are listening to you talking about these very complicated things. And that felt a bit embarrassing. So we brought in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And this has really stayed with me because I think it is clear, whether you have a remote Viva or an in-person Viva, that you have to have some kind of safety and some kind of comfort and feel safe in the space before you can start doing your very best at the top level of self-actualization. So talking complexly about the theoretical perspectives and the contribution to knowledge and doctorateness and so forth doesn't really work if you're uncomfortable, bed, worried and unsafe. So I'd like us to kind of take that one away because that was our major finding. So we had these issues to do with space and place and challenges, and one of us worried about family members coming in. And one of us also talked about with the online Viva that it's different from being in person. I can't read the room at the moment because I'm looking at a screen. Same with the online Viva. You're looking at the candidate and the candidate can't read the room because they're looking at you. So there's something about being in the space together which makes it a more dynamic, perhaps developmental experience. Not sure, not always. So we also used Bourdieu and we came up with this higher duty of care. And there were moments that we were finding when our narratives indicated specific points within the Viva when examiners were satisfied, our questions answered, we began to relax more and discuss the work more as ease, emphasising the end of a period of liminality and the crossing of a conceptual threshold. Through the candidate's demonstration of having acquired the academic capital required for the awards. So there's a relaxing. Said that already. You start talking about what you're going to publish after this and what about going to there is a moment also in a Viva where you can feel the examiners are treating the candidate as a competent doctor in their collegial manner, and the discussion becomes more collegial and they feel like equals. This can happen right about the middle and onwards, and I alert my students to this in advance. They say there'll be a point where they say, what are you going to write next? Are you taking this to a conference? And you go, oh, they're home and dry. I wonder what corrections they'll have. And Joe said the hour went really quickly and the conversation flowed well, and everyone is aware that he demonstrated mastery. So if we can make sure that basic needs are mapped and that people are comfortable in the way in which they're working at such a high level, I think it will help. And what are we doing now? We're doing another patch based in 3 universities, one in New Zealand, one in Gibraltar, and one in the UK, looking at experiences, examiners' experiences, and chairs' experiences. This time we're not interviewing ourselves. We have done all the interviewing of the candidates, the examiners, and the chairs. What parts do they play? How do they drive us to be successful? And I'll stop, I think. Let's see. Oh, that's one happy group after they got through. And there's a different kind of ceremonial happy group got through. So yeah, that's more of a rite of passage. And that one's more of a, oh, we made it. So I'll stop. Thank you.
Thanks, Gina. Well, both of those look lovely. I think I'd probably feel more comfortable sitting around the table with a glass of wine, but they both look like marvelous post-examination events. Thank you so much for all that input. And once again, we're just going to race and tackle questions at the end. I'm very pleased to tell you that I am pretty that Consolata Kabonesa from Makerere University in Uganda is now with us. I wonder if you are able to unmute yourself and talk. Yes.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
I can. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm happy to be with you. Good afternoon, everyone. Are you going to share a presentation or should I try to share?
I think you can try. You can try. If it doesn't succeed, then Charlotte can load it for you. But
yes, I also do have it, so I can share it if you'd like me to.
Oh, there we go. Let's see if this works. There you go. There you go. That's perfect.
There.
Thank you.
So I'm going to talk to these points, and this is based actually on the research we conducted, which was 2021-2022, and it was published with other colleagues. We were actually many, looking at the examiners' experiences. And so here we don't have the students' experiences. We are going to get that experience later on. I'm planning to do that study beginning November. So I'm going to give you the orientation. To begin with, the student is marked, and once the student passes, gets above 60%, then a Viva is actually organized. It is advertised on the website and anybody can attend. The family members can attend. Staff from any of the units, friends, people outside, whoever is interested can attend that. And the candidate is given about 45 minutes to present. After the candidate presents, then the opponent comes in, and I will talk more about the role of the opponent. The opponent comes in, and thereafter, the candidate interacts with a committee of about 7 people. Thereafter, the candidate interacts with the public, who are free to ask any question. And thereafter, then the committee moves out to a different room where they discuss the student's performance, how he or she answered questions, and then they give whether it's passed or she has passed, and whatever questions, corrections they are going to make. And then they come back and the chair of the committee makes the final announcement. Now to go back, what is the role of the opponent? We know that the student has already presented the work in about 45 minutes, looking really at the background, the objectives, looking at the methodology, the key results, and what implications come out of the study for policy briefs. Then the role of the opponent is actually to engage the candidate in a very constructive, scholarly dialogue. Some of them have termed it scientific dialogue. To carry on the candidate to be able to explain the work in a more understandable way, whereby everyone in the audience can be able to understand what the work is all about. And also the opponent can also discuss what the dissertation or the thesis adds within that field. The merits of that dissertation, the pitfalls of the dissertation or the merits of the dissertation. And these normally they do chapter by chapter. And then at the end, the opponent is supposed to provide scientific and scholarly appraisal and critique of the candidate's work. And this one, he does it because he has already gone through with the candidate. They have discussed it for an hour. And that hour is supposed to be a friendly engagement, a friendly dialogue, not attacking the candidate. And thereafter, then we have, I said above all, the role of the opponent is stimulate and maintain that discussion with the candidate while forcing the candidate to defend his thesis or her thesis. And this is why they call it a defense, because the candidate is supposed to say, no, this was my theory, and that's how I used it, and that's how it contributed. If at all the candidate sees that the opponent is bringing in something totally different to take him off what he's presenting. And once he has done that, then the committee comes in, and the committee comes in one by one, not the supervisors, but the committee members themselves. They look at the issues. These issues could be theory issues, methodology. They pick up on any of the areas that may not have been very clear, or that actually where they want to get more information. And then after, when the committee now goes to discuss how the candidate has presented, then they can award the candidate marks. And this marks actually is out of 10, but we know it is out of 60, of 100. And once the candidate gets out of above 60, that candidate has passed the Viva. And the chair of the committee is one actually reports the results back to the audience. They go back, and the chair congratulates the candidate upon passing the Viva. Now, what is the role of the oral examination? According to the interviews we got, the oral examination is supposed to actually certify the candidate as the author of the thesis. The candidate gives evidence justifies the evidence, and at times also draws, if they have used qualitative, gives experiences from the field. And that actually indicates to the examiners that actually the candidate was in the field and did collect the work. It also legitimizes the candidature of the PhD recipient. And once because the candidate is presented to the public, the entire public, and the candidate presents to the public, and therefore he owns that work. He owns whatever he gives to the public. And also, some said that actually the oral examination is very important because it tests the skills of the candidate in as far as communication is concerned, because that candidate is going to become an academic, maybe, or is going to be presenting somewhere in the public, and they want to see whether his communication skills have improved. His maybe the response skills. Does the candidate respond to the posed questions? Because can become annoyed, can become like, what are you asking me this question? You've already said something, yeah? And so to test how the candidate can actually manage the presentation itself. And also they want to see whether the candidate can apply the work to development, because most of the work does add to development. How does it add? And the candidate is able to do that. And in doing that, the candidate is actually satisfying themselves that they can be able to transfer their work from the academic into the development world. And should it be private or should be public? Now, quite a number of our respondents said that actually the oral examination is multi-purpose, and it is important to be held. Why? Because one way they are disseminating their findings, because there is a particular group that does not read the scholarly work that we publish. And so therefore, when the candidate is presenting to the general public, they disseminate their findings. And that introduces also the candidate as a researcher to the entire community. And not only that, they also discussed the issue of legitimizing the process of getting a PhD, acquiring that PhD to the entire public. And again, they also said that it authenticates the authorship of that particular thesis, that this is actually the person who worked on this work and it is genuinely theirs. And also, they said, some people said, well, whether it should be public or not, that is actually debatable. For them, they preferred if it can be private, because in private, the candidate is not exposed to so many people. Not so many people actually were in favor of private one, because they said already for the masters is private. The PhD is advanced, and since it is advanced, it should actually come out into that particular space where they can be vetted by everyone. Then again, there are others who said that in that particular space, the individuals kind of feel attacked. And this is where the role of the chair of the committee comes in. Because in some cases, oral examination can be used to attack on a student or to attack the supervisor of that particular student. And so that's where they were saying it can be debatable. Does it add value? Does it not add value? But if the chair of the Viva is strong, makes sure that all the people who are working, all the committee members stay online, it is a very good space to be in. Now, my personal reflections. I've been an opponent, both internal in Makerere and externally outside Uganda. I have also supervised quite a number of PhD students. I have examined PhD students. I have chaired Vivas of these PhDs. My submission is that it adds value to the candidates' work. The candidates, those ones, like my students at least, what they have said is that it helps them to go through the work and own it and say, yes, I've graduated. Yes, I've defended my dissertation. I've defended my thesis and I have received it. So it makes the candidate feel good. It makes the candidate feel on top of the world that they have actually achieved. It is like they've reached a pinnacle. All this time they were going through, it was kind of low key. But now at the defense, they defend and go through, they really feel good. And by the way, I haven't seen any student who made the Viva, because the Viva in our university is supposed to say, did you go to the field? Did you not go to the field? Did you write this work or did you not write this work? And in most cases, they found the students, the PhD candidates, done those things. And the family, more important, the family that comes to participate appreciates what their relative has gone through. It is a lot of work. They stay up in the night. And if it is the spouse appreciates what their spouse has gone through to get to this period, to get at least to this stage. But it can also be a bad experience to some candidates. And that's where I said that actually the chair's work is very important during the Viva. And overall, the process is very healthy. I'm going to end by saying that at Makerere, we did this work we conducted in 21, 22, and we published in 23. And since the beginning of this year or early last year, they actually now have the candidate address all the comments from the supervisors and from the examiners. And then when they come to do their Viva, they are almost done with their dissertation and their thesis. And so the questions are fewer. In some cases, actually, they go from there to address a few questions and then submit. Thank you very much. I'm here to answer any of the questions that you may have. And by the way, I've since then retired, but I'm going to go on and continue and do my research. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Consolata. I don't know if academics retire. I keep meeting academics who tell me they retire, but seeing as I meet them at work-related events, I'm personally not convinced in this whole retirement thing. But whatever, it is so lovely. It's so great to have with us. And thank you so much for your inputs. Let's Charlotte, you can put the poster up just so that we can see the faces of our very generous presenters today. And I think we now need to open it up for questions and comments. There has been a lively conversation happening in the chat. And so if any of you who've already put your comments in the chat would like to raise the issue with our speakers, please do feel free to put up your hand, and or just put up your hand if you've got some question or comment that you would like addressed by our speakers today. Thank you, Richard. Go ahead. You've got to unmute yourself.
Sue, I'm just going to unmute, allow people to unmute themselves. Give me a second.
Oh, okay. Okay. Sorry, I think we might have made it so that you could not unmute yourself, but we just can change.
There, it should be working now.
There we go. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Yes, thanks. I thought it was something that I was doing wrong. I'm very much in favor of this process. What I am hearing, though, is quite a bit of confusion as to whether it's a ceremony, a party with family and all the rest of it, or whether it actually is a very rigorous examination process that can fail people. Because I think that's what we need. But if there's even the remotest chance that somebody could be, subjected to very, very tough questioning and fail to perform and then fail the PhD, you would not want that to be in public or in front of family or friends. I think the thesis defense should be in private, but it can always be followed by a sort of coming out party for those who pass.
Thanks, Richard. Let's hear from which of our speakers would like to jump on that issue, because it's something that you all raised, is this sort of tension between the ceremonial, the rite of passage, the rigorous interrogation. One of the things you did say was around this sort of notion, I think it was Gina, that while a resubmission or a failure is certainly a possibility, one doesn't enter the Viva expecting that your job is to, I think you used the word catch, that your job is to catch the student. So it's a very different kind of attitude towards it, but nonetheless still a rigorous examination. Do you want to jump in? Have I got that right?
I don't think I said that, but it sounds clever, so I'll claim
sorry.
it. The experiences I've had with the Scandinavian Viva, what happens is that the examiners examine the thesis beforehand and say it's passed. And so in a sense, the questioning with all your friends and family present is a more of a performance and celebration. And when I got, because I'd examined them, but I'd not done orals, and then I went and did the oral bit and felt worried, am I examining them in front of their friends and family, just like you said? And no, it had already passed, and this was a ceremonial activity. So I don't know if that's true all over Scandinavia and Europe.
Yes, I think that's really important. Yes, sorry, carry on. Yeah, so I think it's really important that we all know that there are very different forms and that they therefore serve different purposes. And I think Martin pointed out that we need to make sure that our examiners, the examiners, they know what form of Viva they're engaging in and don't just assume that their practices from their home institution are pertinent here. Let's go to next question. I'm not sure of the order of hands. There we go. Thiri Pariachi.
Thank you very much. Just following on from what the last speaker said, it creates a little bit of confusion, and I'm not sure at which stage of the examination process would you introduce the Viva. Because if I'm not mistaken, I'm sure I heard the speaker say after the Viva, the dissertation is then submitted. And I would think that would happen before the Viva, because that's the official examination process that happens, and then the student gets the corrections are done, and then the challenge is after the corrections are done. And so that's one thing that I'm not sure of at what stage it would be important to do. The second thing that I think the Viva is really, really important to be introduced in our institutions in South Africa, simply because of authenticity of the work. Because you're finding that, so many students are completing doctorals under the recommended time frame, and there's no verification of the authenticity, the choice of examiners being used repeatedly, lends itself to, whether we're doing the right thing, or are we just under pressure to produce PhD graduates because it impacts our university's funding model and rating and all of that. So for me, from that point of view, I do think that the Viva is like a critical tool that we could use to make sure that our qualifications that we are awarding, and the doctoral qualification is a huge qualification, is authentic, and the student, deserves it and did do the work. And especially with generative AI now, and the lack of tools of evaluating whether the student used generative AI to write up that dissertation. And if you have different processes, like I think, or one of the other in the chat, where there's different presentation stages, the Viva shouldn't be used at the final stage to determine whether the student has presentation skills. Because at a doctoral level, the student should be encouraged through that research process to present at conferences, whether national or international. So that skill would have developed. You don't measure that skill at the end when you're about to award. Yeah, thank you for that.
Thanks. Thank you so much. I think just given our time constraints, I'm going to go get everyone with their hand up to quickly raise their point, and then I'm going to get each of our speakers if they want to respond to any of the comments that have been raised. Nicola Graham.
Yes, thank you. I just also, I put it in the chat, but a candidate with quite extreme anxiety disorders, where any form of oral defense is so overwhelming that it just, becomes it's impossible for them sometimes. I just wonder, to our panel, do they have, can you get can you be released from that obligation in exceptional circumstances? I'm just wondering about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicola. I'm going to park that question. That's a good one, and we'll ask our panelists to answer in a moment. Sehlabaka. Hi.
Yes, thanks, Chair, and good afternoon, colleagues. I think the past few speakers have actually addressed my question, but I'll just shorten it. I'm actually in support of it. However, my concern or my worry is what happens if a student is unable to defend or he fails the Viva. Do we proceed with awarding, or what measures should be taken? So this is my only concern, although I am in favor due to some of the issues that have been raised. I think one of the issues was AI, and also some of the students, I don't want to say, but some people write for students thesis. So one of the concern would be a precautionary measure to ensure quality assurance. But my question is basically what happens if the student is unable to defend or he fails the Viva, because we should also take in consideration the last speaker mentioned the issues of anxiety disorder, and some of the students are able to present although they have actually completed the work. So thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Sehlabaka. Next, Timothy.
Greetings all. Thank you. So my concern is particularly in the medical field. I'm a surgeon and a researcher, and I've supervised quite a few PhDs, and I've examined as an opponent in Sweden and Norway. And I like the way the Swedes and the Norwegians do it. It becomes a sort of a presentation of the thesis rather than a pass or fail thing. And I think that's an important aspect. The Viva should not be pass or fail. I would feel very strongly about that based on my experiences, both as a marker and as a supervisor. And I think one aspect that we forget is that a lot of research for PhDs has moved away from the true thesis submission, where a big tome is submitted and examined, to the compilation of between 3 and 6 papers, all of which have been peer reviewed, often by the same group of peer reviewers, especially if you're in a fairly narrow field. So yes, putting that together and presenting the thesis may be a useful aspect, but I really feel that the Viva should not be the pass or fail. The thesis should have already been examined, corrections made, and this is kind of just an opportunity to present it and finalize. So that's an important concept that I think we have to keep in mind in the South African context, particularly with the PhDs and M.Meds and things by published.
Thank you so much, Timothy. And next, Manoj.
Yes, thank you. These discussions have largely been predicated on an ethical foundation. In other words, everybody's acting ethically, and this is unfortunately with the commodification of education and the pressures placed on universities, supervisors, and students. I don't think we can make that assumption anymore, and for me that is a problem. And I made the comment at the beginning about the availability of large language models. And prior to large language models, we had thesis models which students could pay and have theses written for them. It's become even easier now. So, and not only in terms of writing, content, it's about generating content as well. You could generate almost real, certainly synthetic, but real looking data to support your thesis and to research. So we need to find ways to, unfortunately, we need to find ways to do that. And the only way, I think, is a Viva process. I've been advocating for that at my university for a long time now, and it seems to be, and I'm in South Africa, so it seems to be the CHE is coming along to the same way of thinking. But it's something that we need to think that it is, it has to be a quality control process. We need to provide assurance to the consumers of our products that what we are producing is valid and of the quality we're claiming it to be. And the advent of large language models and the proliferation of large language models and the skills of these models, if I could use that word, makes this a very, very big problem. And I suggest that the Viva is part of the solution. I don't know if it's the only solution. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for those comments and questions. And I think what we clearly saw within them were the kinds of tensions that exist between the models and the purposes of the Viva. We've only got less than 10 minutes left, so I'm going to ask each of our speakers in turn to chip in on any or all of the issues raised, and to feel free, if you don't get a chance to make the point you'd like to make in your few minutes left, please feel free to type some stuff into the chat bar. Martin, let's start with you. Any comments you want to make? Martin, you are muted. Okay, I'm going to jump to Carolyn. We'll come back to Martin. Carolyn. Yeah.
Okay.
There's Martin. There's Martin.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. I'll make a few comments and try and be very brief. On the comments about ethics and authenticity, I'm much inclined to agree that we need rigor and a process. The word examination is probably not the only word, but for example, you could have more than one Viva at more than one time. For example, and this is a way of checking authenticity and who wrote what, you can have a thesis proposal with a viva, and then a year later or at a suitable interval later, you can have the actual thesis submission and a viva. And that if one or two supervisors are monitoring the generation of that, that doesn't guarantee, but it certainly minimizes the likely influence of AI. It's possible to fail a viva in some cases. Some universities insist that the viva must be passed before the degree can be awarded, and those universities, for example in Britain, have the possibility of a second viva. I've taken part in two of those personally, and the reason for them, one was a lack of understanding of the statistics, and another was the lack of understanding of methodology and familiarity with methods. That seemed to be valid reasons for having another viva. On the question of anxiety and things like that, I think we could be flexible about the format. The question about where it is, who is present, could it be in somebody's home, could it be in some other comfortable place? We could have rehearsals, we can certainly have mock vivas, we can have familiarity with making presentations, of course, as somebody made that point, this is part of the process, and so on. I'll just make one other point. I think for the feedback in the viva and in reports after the viva, it might be wise to think of three kinds. One is to validate what is good, commend it, say why it's good, and praise what is worthy of praise. Second, to point out what is bad or weak or problematic or needs to be amended and corrected. And third, to think in terms of development. So this third idea is not just publishing and so on, but ideas about suggestions, advice. Have you thought of this? Have you connected your work with that wider field? That kind of idea. I think that would also apply to PhDs by publication with peer-reviewed work. So it's not necessarily examining what has already been checked in some ways, but thinking about its development and worthiness.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Martin. Carolyn.
Thanks. I'll just pick up on a couple of points. I won't repeat what Martin said or the issues. One is, I think, thinking really carefully about the purpose. And so I think there is a big difference between like the UK system that's behind closed doors and the public ones, which are much more ceremonial and usually do include an evaluation of the thesis in some kind of private context before the ceremony. And that's really important because, as people have said, you don't want somebody failing in front of their family and friends and everybody else. Linked to that, I think with those ceremonial ones, there can be a huge amount of work on us. So, you know, in Belgium, for example, I did a viva where there was, examiner thesis where there was a viva behind closed doors and then a public ceremonial one. It's twice as much work quite often for the examiners. In Iceland recently, you know, I went out and did a viva where, again, you do a presentation about the candidate's work as well as asking questions in a public setting. In Finland, I had to do half an hour presentation to people about the candidate's work and then ask them questions for an hour and a half in public. So those add a lot of work to the examiners. So thinking about, you know, what you can expect examiners to do, if you want examiners to agree to be involved in it, I think is really important. There's a lot of work that goes on, and the work isn't well paid. So we're asking a lot of our academic colleagues. So I think we need to think about how much work we're asking them to do when we're thinking about what model of vivas we have. But having said that, you know, I do think that the vivas can be really important, and that authenticating that the work is the candidate's own and being able to follow up questions. What examinations that I've done that involve no vivas at all, I found quite frustrating because I wanted to talk to the candidates about them. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very interesting final point there, that it really allows for that conversation. And your point about not being paid much is also important. It was great in the days when they used to fly you over, then it was worth it. But now that it's just asking you to get onto Zoom at 3 o'clock in the morning, it's lost some of its thrill. Anyway, let's hear from Consolata. Any comments from you? Any last comments you'd like to make?
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to repeat again that the process starts with sending out the thesis to be marked by examiners. There is an external examiner who is outside the university itself. Then 2 external examiners, examiners within the university. Once those pass the thesis above 60%, then a Viva is organized, it is advertised, and that's when actually the oral examination takes place. And it is rigorous, it is very rigorous, and it actually gives the student a chance to defend themselves and to defend their work. And in terms of anxiety, we haven't really gone through it. I haven't seen it, but in that case, if it is already known that a student has anxiety, it is better to have dummy presentations where the student actually can practice to present beforehand, and when it comes to the oral examination is already okay. The skilling of communication and other skills, we have mastered them, because throughout the training of a PhD, they do presentations, they go to the conferences, but at those conferences, the supervisors and the examiners are not there. So now here they want to see, have they really mastered these skills that they are going to be using, say, in the classroom? You're going to use if they are called for a conference elsewhere, or if they are going to defend a proposal to a government. They want to see those kind of skills. I think it is very important for us to know that oral defense is very important, like all my colleagues have already said. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
With 30 seconds left, Gina, is there anything you want to add?
Only that I've seen a reviver used in 3 different contexts to bring some kind of justice to, in 2 cases, a very destructive experience for the student, and in 1 case to ensure that even after a year, the student who clearly had faked their work had still faked it when they went for the second Viva. So I think the justice element is probably something else to think about.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I know my head is buzzing and I feel like we've barely touched the surface of all these interesting things. I hope that some of you will follow up on some of the readings that I shared. And I really want to thank our 4 panelists. As you'll see from the comments, people are all saying that it's been useful. A lot of us are really trying to put our heads together around this issue. And what's really become clear to me is that we need to understand, either at a sector level or certainly at a university level, what is the purpose of the Viva in our institution? Because if we don't decide what the purpose is for us, we're never going to get the process right. Thank you so much to our very generous colleagues for sharing their time with us. And thank you so much to the very large group of people that joined us. And Shala will be in touch with you soon with a link to the recording. And we look forward to having you soon. We're still trying to set the date for another session, which is looking at the nuts and bolts, the practicalities of when someone loses their connection on Zoom or when suddenly someone is absent. Thank you, guys. Keep well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.